Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The red light that changed me. Have you ever felt like your life was moving too slowly while everyone else seemed to know exactly where they were going? That was me one quiet morning in the United States, sitting at a red light with nothing in front of my car except an empty road. My foot wanted to move. My mind wanted to hurry. But what happened over the next few minutes completely changed the way I understood patience, freedom, marriage, and even the way I learned English. It all started with one traffic rule that seemed unnecessary, until I finally understood why it existed. My name is Emily, and this story happened in the United States not long ago. It was a bright weekday morning. The sky was clear, the streets were clean, and I was driving alone to a neighborhood grocery store after dropping my children off at school. It was an ordinary day, the kind of day that usually disappears from memory. But this one never did. I stopped at a red light near a quiet intersection. I looked around. No cars crossed in front of me. No pedestrians were waiting. No bicycles. Nothing. The road looked completely empty. Without thinking, I whispered to myself, why am I still waiting? The light stayed red. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. It felt strangely long. My hands rested on the steering wheel while my eyes moved from the traffic signal to the empty road and back again. Every part of me wanted the light to change. Then I noticed something surprising. The driver in the car beside me wasn't frustrated. He wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't honking. He simply waited. Calmly. A few seconds later, I looked into my rearview mirror. The driver behind me looked just as relaxed. No one seemed impatient. No one tried to rush. The silence inside that intersection felt almost unbelievable. When the light finally turned green, every car moved smoothly at the same moment. Almost like a quiet dance that nobody had practiced but everyone understood. As I continued driving, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had just seen. Back at home later that afternoon, I mentioned it to my husband while making lunch. I don't understand, I said. There wasn't a single car coming. Why did everyone just wait? He smiled as if he had heard that question many times before. What do you think would happen if everyone decided the rules only mattered when they felt convenient? I laughed. I guess traffic would become interesting. He smiled. Exactly. His answer sounded simple. Too simple. Surely there had to be more to it than that. That evening, while practicing English by listening to a local radio station during dinner, I heard a phrase that immediately caught my attention. Safety begins with predictable behavior. I quietly repeated the sentence. Predictable behavior. The words stayed in my mind. Later, I searched their meaning and realized they weren't only describing traffic. They described trust. When people follow the same rules, everyone can predict what happens next. That makes life safer. It also makes communication easier. The next morning, I drove the same route again. This time, I paid less attention to the traffic lights and more attention to the people. Drivers stopped behind crosswalks without blocking them. Cars waited patiently before turning. Pedestrians crossed confidently because they trusted vehicles would stop. Nobody seemed to be competing. Instead, everyone appeared to be cooperating without speaking a single word. Something unexpected happened inside me. I stopped feeling trapped by the rules. Instead, I began feeling protected by them. That tiny change in perspective surprised me more than I wanted to admit. As I parked outside the grocery store, I smiled without knowing why. Maybe patience wasn't wasting time. Maybe patience was quietly creating freedom for everyone. I had no idea that only 2 days later, one unexpected moment at a busy four-way stop would test everything I thought I had learned. In less than 30 seconds, one decision made by a complete stranger would leave me speechless. Challenge everything I believed about driving in America, and reveal a lesson my family would continue talking about for years. The four-way stop surprise. I thought I understood American traffic after waiting at that lonely red light. I was wrong. 2 days later, I arrived at a four-way stop where 4 cars reached the intersection almost at the exact same moment. No traffic officer. No traffic lights. No one shouted. No one honked. Yet within seconds, every driver somehow knew exactly who should move first. I froze behind the wheel, afraid that one wrong decision would embarrass me, or even cause an accident. What happened next completely changed the way I understood patience, respect, and even everyday English. That Friday afternoon, I was driving home after buying groceries for the weekend. The sky had turned cloudy, and a light breeze pushed colorful leaves across the quiet neighborhood streets. I wasn't in a hurry, but I still felt nervous whenever I entered unfamiliar intersections. Then I saw the sign. Stop. Not just for me. For every direction. I slowed down and stopped completely behind the white line. Almost at the same time, 3 other vehicles stopped around the intersection. For one awkward second, nobody moved. My heart started beating faster. I quietly asked myself, who's supposed to go first? I remembered reading something about four-way stops, but suddenly every rule disappeared from my memory. The driver on my left smiled and gently waved one hand toward the car across from him. The other driver nodded politely. That car moved first. Then the driver on my right continued. Finally, it was my turn. No confusion. No rushing. No angry expressions. Everything happened naturally, almost as if the drivers had silently agreed on the same invisible language. As I slowly drove through the intersection, I couldn't stop smiling. It felt less like traffic and more like teamwork. Later that evening, I told my husband what had happened. I was so nervous, I admitted. I thought someone would get impatient. He laughed softly. Did anyone honk? Not once. He poured 2 cups of tea before answering. People usually expect everyone to follow the same rule. That expectation makes driving calmer. His words reminded me of something I had recently learned while practicing English. Expectation. Predictability. Confidence. Those ideas suddenly seemed connected. The next day, I became curious enough to look up the basic rule again. The first vehicle to stop generally has the right to go first. If 2 vehicles arrive together, the driver on the right usually has priority. Simple. Logical. Easy to remember. I smiled because the English explanation itself was surprisingly easy to understand. Reading real traffic rules became another unexpected way to improve my vocabulary. Words like yield, intersection, crosswalk, and right-of-way slowly stopped feeling difficult because I could immediately connect them with real situations I had experienced. During the following week, I noticed something interesting. The more I understood the rules, the less anxious I became. Psychologists often explain that uncertainty increases stress because the brain constantly searches for possible dangers. Clear rules reduce that mental effort, allowing people to stay calmer and make better decisions. I wasn't reading a psychology textbook while driving, of course, but I could feel the difference inside myself. My shoulders relaxed. My breathing became steadier. Even my English listening improved because fear was no longer filling my thoughts. A few days later, I experienced something even more surprising. While waiting at another four-way stop, I accidentally hesitated when it was actually my turn to go. I expected the driver behind me to become impatient. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. The driver simply smiled, waited quietly, and gave me another friendly wave. No pressure. No frustration. Just patience. That tiny gesture stayed with me for the rest of the day. I didn't realize it then, but this was only the beginning. The next lesson wouldn't come from a traffic sign at all. It would come from something almost every driver uses without thinking, a car horn. After weeks of driving through American neighborhoods, I suddenly noticed something so unusual that I asked my husband if my ears were playing tricks on me. His answer revealed another surprising truth about life on American roads. Why nobody was honking? One question refused to leave my mind. Where were all the angry drivers? After weeks of driving through busy streets in the United States, I realized something almost unbelievable. I could drive for an entire day without hearing a single car horn. At first, I thought I was simply lucky. Then one unexpected moment in heavy traffic proved it wasn't luck at all. It was a completely different way of thinking, and understanding it quietly changed not only how I drove but also how I spoke, listened, and reacted to people every day. One Monday afternoon, I was driving home after meeting a friend for coffee. Traffic was heavier than usual because a construction crew had closed one lane near a busy intersection. Cars lined up patiently, moving only a few feet every minute. I expected frustration. Instead, I saw something completely different. Drivers stayed inside their cars, listening to music, talking with family members, or simply waiting quietly. Nobody leaned on the horn. Nobody tried to squeeze into tiny spaces. Nobody shouted through open windows. The atmosphere felt surprisingly peaceful. I smiled to myself. This can't be normal, I whispered. Just then, the traffic stopped completely. A delivery truck ahead struggled to make a difficult turn. It took longer than expected. I waited. The driver behind me waited. Everyone waited. Still no horns. Finally, the truck completed its turn, and traffic began moving again as smoothly as if nothing unusual had happened. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. While preparing dinner, I asked my husband the question that had been growing inside my mind for days. Why doesn't everyone honk? He smiled before answering. Because most of the time, it doesn't solve the problem. I laughed. That's it? He nodded. If the car in front can't move, the horn doesn't create more space. I looked at him for a second. He continued. It usually creates more stress instead. His answer sounded almost too simple. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. The next morning, while driving the children to school, I paid close attention again. When another driver merged into my lane a little more slowly than expected, the car behind simply reduced speed. No dramatic reaction. No angry gestures. Just a small adjustment. It reminded me of something I had recently learned while practicing English. Communication isn't always about making more noise. Sometimes it's about understanding the situation before reacting. That idea stayed with me throughout the week. Even my English conversations began to change. When I didn't understand someone immediately, I stopped interrupting with nervous apologies. Instead, I calmly listened until the meaning became clear. Ironically, people seemed to understand me better when I became more patient. Researchers often explain that emotional self-control improves decision-making because the brain has more time to process information instead of reacting automatically. I wasn't thinking about neuroscience while sitting in traffic, but I could feel the difference. My driving became smoother. My conversations became calmer. Even difficult moments felt easier because I no longer believed every delay was an emergency. One afternoon, I experienced a small but unforgettable example. A young driver accidentally stalled at a green light. For several seconds, the car didn't move. I instinctively expected someone to honk. Nobody did. Instead, the driver behind waited quietly. After a moment, the engine started again. The young driver raised one hand through the window in a silent gesture of thanks. The driver behind smiled and waved back. That tiny exchange lasted only a few seconds. Yet it taught me more about respect than dozens of articles I had read online. As I drove away, I realized patience wasn't slowing life down. It was preventing unnecessary conflict before it even began. I thought I had finally begun to understand American traffic culture. Then, only a few days later, my husband explained one simple driving habit that completely challenged everything I believed about freedom. At first, I disagreed with him. But after one unforgettable family trip, I realized he had been right all along, and that lesson would stay with me every time I touched the steering wheel. My husband's simple rule. I used to believe that freedom meant doing whatever I wanted whenever I wanted. Then my husband said one quiet sentence during a weekend drive that completely challenged that idea. At first, I smiled because it sounded too simple to be important. A few hours later, after watching something unexpected happen on a busy American highway, I realized that one sentence explained not only traffic rules but also marriage, family, and even why learning English had suddenly become less stressful. It all started with a lane change that almost didn't happen. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and our family had decided to drive to a nearby state park. The children were excited about hiking, my husband was choosing music for the drive, and I was behind the wheel. Traffic was steady but comfortable. Cars moved at different speeds, yet everything felt surprisingly organized. As I prepared to change lanes, I turned on my signal. Almost immediately, the driver beside me slowed down slightly and created enough space for my car. I looked in the mirror. Nobody seemed annoyed. Nobody accelerated to block me. The lane change happened so naturally that it almost felt rehearsed. A few minutes later, I smiled and said, "People here are incredibly patient." My husband looked out the window before answering. It's not only patience. What is it then? It's respect made visible. I repeated his words quietly. Respect made visible. He nodded. When you use your turn signal, you're telling other drivers what you're about to do. You're making yourself predictable. That gives everyone else the freedom to make safe decisions. For the next several miles, I couldn't stop thinking about that idea. Predictability creates freedom. The sentence sounded almost backwards. Wouldn't more rules create less freedom? Then I started paying closer attention. Every lane change came with a signal. Every exit was clearly marked. Every driver seemed to know what the others were likely to do. Instead of limiting movement, those simple rules allowed thousands of people to travel together smoothly without speaking a single word. Later that afternoon, while eating lunch in the park, I asked my husband another question. Do you think this applies outside driving? He smiled immediately. Of course. He pointed toward our children, who were patiently waiting their turn at a drinking fountain. They know they'll get water because everyone follows the same order. I watched them quietly. Nobody pushed. Nobody argued. Each child simply waited. Then my husband looked at me. Marriage works the same way. I laughed softly. How? When two people respect simple agreements every day, trust grows without anyone noticing. His answer stayed with me for the rest of the weekend. That evening, I realized something surprising about my English learning too. The conversations that felt easiest weren't the ones with perfect vocabulary. They were the ones where people spoke clearly, listened patiently, and gave each other time to respond. Communication, like driving, became smoother when everyone followed simple expectations. Psychologists often explain that predictable environments reduce mental stress because the brain doesn't have to constantly prepare for unexpected threats. Looking back, I could actually feel that happening. Driving no longer exhausted me. Speaking English no longer felt like standing in front of an audience. Little by little, my confidence was growing because I trusted the process instead of fearing every small mistake. On the drive home, our son suddenly asked from the back seat, "Why does everyone stop even when nobody is watching?" Neither my husband nor I answered immediately. It was one of those questions that sounded simple but carried a much deeper meaning. I smiled into the rearview mirror and realized the answer wasn't really about traffic anymore. It was about character. Only a few days later, that very question would return in a way none of us expected. A small moment involving our children at a quiet crosswalk would become one of the most powerful lessons our family had ever shared. And it would prove that the most important rules are often the ones we choose to follow when nobody is looking. The crosswalk that stopped everyone. I never expected a painted white crosswalk to become one of the most unforgettable classrooms in my life. It wasn't a driving lesson. It wasn't an English lesson. It wasn't even about traffic anymore. It was about what happened when one small child stepped toward the edge of the road. Within seconds, every moving car around us came to a complete stop. And the silence that followed taught my entire family something more powerful than any rule written in a driver's handbook. It happened on a cool Sunday afternoon after lunch. My husband, our children, and I decided to walk through a nearby downtown area filled with cafes, bookstores, and small family-owned shops. The streets were lively but peaceful. People carried coffee cups, cyclists passed quietly, and musicians played soft jazz on a nearby sidewalk. As we approached a marked crosswalk, my daughter held my hand while my son walked beside my husband. We stopped at the curb. I looked left. Then right. Several cars were approaching. Instinctively, I expected to wait. Before I could even take a step back, something remarkable happened. The first driver slowed down. Then stopped. The second car stopped too. Within only a few seconds, every vehicle in both directions had come to a complete stop. No horns. No frustration. No one tried to drive around us. The drivers simply smiled and waited. I looked at my husband in disbelief. "They're waiting for us?" He smiled. "Of course." I laughed quietly. "But we haven't even crossed yet." He nodded. "They're giving you the opportunity." Those words stayed with me as we slowly walked across the street. Halfway across, my daughter waved happily at one of the drivers. To my surprise, the driver waved back with a warm smile. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Yet somehow it made the whole moment feel deeply human. When we reached the other side, my son asked a question that caught both of us off guard. "Why did all the cars stop for us?" My husband looked at him and answered gently. "Because every person matters." The sentence sounded beautifully simple. But it carried enormous meaning. As we continued walking, I kept replaying that moment in my mind. Nobody knew us. Nobody expected anything in return. Yet dozens of strangers had paused their own journeys so our family could cross safely. That wasn't only about traffic. It was about respect. Later that week, while driving alone, I approached another crosswalk. A man pushing a stroller stood waiting on the sidewalk. Without hesitation, I stopped. He smiled and nodded. I smiled back. For the first time, I wasn't stopping because I remembered a rule. I was stopping because I understood the reason behind it. Something else surprised me that day. The English words I had learned through real experiences became much easier to remember. Crosswalk. Pedestrian. Yield. Safety. Instead of memorizing vocabulary from a list, I connected each word to an emotion and a real memory. Language experts often explain that our brains remember information more effectively when it's linked to meaningful experiences. Looking back, I realized that every drive through town had quietly become another English lesson. That evening, our daughter drew a picture of our family walking across the crosswalk while colorful cars waited patiently on both sides. Above the drawing, she wrote one sentence in careful handwriting. "People waited because we matter." I felt unexpectedly emotional. A traffic rule had become a family value. As I placed her drawing on the refrigerator, I realized these simple moments were shaping our children in ways we could never measure. But only a few days later, another situation would challenge everything we thought we had learned. This time, the lesson wouldn't happen at a crosswalk. It would happen inside our own car when impatience almost caused me to make a dangerous decision, and the science behind what happened next completely changed the way I understood both driving and learning English. The day my brain chose patience. Most people think patience is just a personality trait. I used to believe that too. Then one ordinary afternoon on an American highway, I caught myself making a decision that could have ended very badly. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no crash, no police officer, no loud argument. Instead, one tiny pause, lasting only a few seconds, completely changed the outcome. Later that evening, I discovered the surprising science behind that moment. And it explained not only why traffic rules work but also why learning English had suddenly started feeling easier than ever before. It happened on my way home after picking up groceries. The highway was busier than usual because several lanes narrowed ahead for road maintenance. Cars slowed down, brake lights stretched into the distance, and everyone merged into a single lane. At first, I stayed calm. Then I noticed the clock. I was running a little late. My thoughts immediately changed. If I switch lanes now, maybe I'll get home faster. I looked into the mirror. Another lane seemed to be moving slightly quicker. Without thinking very carefully, I almost turned the steering wheel. Then I remembered something my husband had said. Predictability creates freedom. I stopped myself. I stayed exactly where I was. Only a few seconds later, the faster lane came to a complete stop while my lane continued moving steadily. I smiled. The shortcut I almost took would actually have delayed me. When I finally arrived home, I couldn't stop thinking about those few seconds. Why had I suddenly become so impatient? Later that evening, while reading a short English article for listening and vocabulary practice, I found an explanation that fascinated me. Psychologists explain that when people feel rushed, the brain often shifts into automatic decision-making. Instead of carefully evaluating the situation, it searches for immediate rewards, even if those choices increase long-term risk. A brief pause gives the thinking part of the brain enough time to regain control. That sounded surprisingly familiar. Those few seconds had saved me from making a poor decision. The next morning, I decided to try a small experiment. Whenever I felt impatient while driving, I would take one slow breath before reacting. Nothing complicated. Just one breath. The results surprised me almost immediately. I noticed traffic flowing more clearly. I saw pedestrians earlier. I anticipated other drivers' movements more naturally. Most importantly, I stopped feeling like every delay was stealing something from me. The same habit quietly began helping my English learning too. When I couldn't remember a word during conversation, I stopped panicking. Instead of filling the silence with nervous apologies, I simply paused, breathed, and continued speaking. More often than not, the word appeared naturally. Ironically, speaking more slowly made me sound more confident. One afternoon, while waiting at another intersection, I watched a young driver become visibly frustrated. He changed lanes twice within less than a minute, hoping to move ahead faster. A few moments later, our cars met again at the very same red light. I couldn't help smiling. Neither of us had arrived any earlier. The only difference was that I had enjoyed a much calmer drive. That tiny moment reminded me of another simple truth. Sometimes patience doesn't save time. It saves energy. And saving emotional energy makes every part of life feel lighter. By the end of that week, I realized something remarkable. Traffic rules were teaching me far more than driving skills. They were quietly training my attention, my emotional control, and even my confidence with everyday English conversations. I thought I had learned the biggest lesson already. Then, during a routine drive with the radio playing softly in the background, one simple English phrase caught my attention. Those few ordinary words would send me looking at every road sign differently and reveal that America's streets had been teaching me English all along. Without me even realizing it. The road became my English teacher. What if I told you that one of the best English teachers I ever had didn't stand in a classroom? It didn't give homework. It didn't correct my grammar. It simply guided me through American streets every single day. Somewhere between traffic signs, GPS directions, radio voices, and short conversations with strangers. I realized I was learning real English without forcing myself to study. Then one unexpected drive across town proved that the road had been teaching me much more than vocabulary. It had quietly been teaching me confidence. One Tuesday morning, I volunteered to pick up a birthday cake for my daughter's school celebration. The bakery was in a neighborhood I had never visited before, so I entered the address into my GPS. The calm voice immediately spoke. In 500 feet, turn right. Years earlier, I would have repeated every sentence in my head, worried about understanding each word. Now something felt different. I understood naturally. As I drove through the neighborhood, I began noticing familiar expressions everywhere. Speed limit. School zone. Merge left. Road work ahead. Yield. Months earlier, those signs had looked like random English vocabulary. Now they felt like old friends. Without realizing it, I quietly read every sign aloud. Not because I had to. Because I enjoyed it. At the next intersection, the GPS announced, "At the roundabout, take the second exit." I smiled. Even instructions that once sounded complicated now felt completely normal. Later, after picking up the cake, I stopped at a small neighborhood cafe for coffee. The cashier greeted me warmly. "How's your day going?" Instead of giving my usual short answer, I smiled confidently. "It's been busy, but it's a beautiful morning." We talked for another minute about the weather and local traffic before I left. As I walked back to my car, I suddenly realized something important. That conversation had happened naturally. I hadn't translated sentences inside my head. I hadn't worried about making mistakes. I had simply spoken. Driving home, I turned on a local radio station. The hosts discussed road construction, weekend events, and traffic updates. Although I didn't understand every single word, I understood the main ideas without feeling frustrated. That small success made me unexpectedly happy. Later that evening, I shared the experience with my husband. "I think driving has improved my English." He laughed. "It doesn't surprise me." "Why not?" "Because you're learning words inside real situations." His answer reminded me of something language researchers often explain. Vocabulary connected to real experiences stays in long-term memory much more effectively than isolated word lists. When the brain links language with actions, emotions, and places, remembering becomes easier and far more natural. Looking back, I realized that every drive had quietly become another English lesson. Every road sign introduced useful vocabulary. Every GPS instruction improved listening. Every polite conversation at a coffee shop strengthened my confidence. Even waiting at red lights gave me time to read nearby signs and practice pronunciation. One afternoon, while stopped behind a school bus, I noticed children carefully crossing the street while every vehicle waited patiently. The flashing lights reflected across dozens of quiet cars. Nobody tried to pass. Nobody complained. In that peaceful moment, one English phrase suddenly came into my mind. Safety first. Only two simple words. Yet they perfectly described everything I had been learning. Not just language. Not just driving. A way of thinking. As I drove away, I realized my confidence no longer came from speaking perfect English. It came from trusting myself enough to keep learning every day. But only a few mornings later, that confidence would be tested in the most unexpected way. One careless decision, made in less than a second, would almost cause an accident. And the calm response of a complete stranger would teach me the final lesson I never saw coming. The mistake that changed everything. I always believed serious driving lessons came after accidents. I was fortunate enough to discover that sometimes the most powerful lesson arrives just before one happens. One ordinary morning, I made a tiny mistake that lasted less than 2 seconds. No collision followed. No police lights flashed behind me. But the calm reaction of a complete stranger left a deeper impression than any warning ever could. That single moment completely changed the way I thought about responsibility, kindness, and why patience can quietly save lives without anyone realizing it. It happened on a cool Wednesday morning while I was driving to meet a friend for breakfast. The streets were already busy with commuters, school buses, cyclists, and parents dropping off children at nearby schools. Everything felt routine. I approached a familiar intersection where traffic moved smoothly in every direction. As the light turned green, I glanced for just a moment at the GPS screen to confirm my next turn. Only 1 second. Maybe 2. When I looked back up, the car in front of me had slowed much more quickly than I expected. My heart jumped. I immediately pressed the brake pedal. The car stopped safely. There was still enough distance. Nothing happened. But I knew how close that moment had been. I took one slow breath. Then I looked into the rearview mirror. The driver behind me had also stopped calmly. No horn. No angry expression. No dramatic hand gestures. Just a quiet smile. I couldn't believe it. At the next red light, our cars stopped beside each other. The driver looked over, smiled kindly, and gave a simple thumbs up as if to say, "Everything's okay." I smiled back, feeling both relieved and grateful. That tiny act of kindness stayed with me long after the traffic light turned green. Later that afternoon, I couldn't stop replaying the situation in my mind. I asked myself one important question. What prevented this from becoming something much worse? The answer wasn't luck. It was preparation. Because everyone had left enough following distance. Because nobody was speeding. Because every driver expected unexpected situations. Traffic rules weren't only preventing mistakes. They were creating space for human imperfection. That realization touched me deeply. None of us drive perfectly every second. None of us speak perfect English every day either. We're all human. We all hesitate. We all make small mistakes. The important part is creating enough patience to recover safely. That evening, while practicing English, I repeated one sentence I had heard on the local radio. Leave yourself enough room. It referred to driving. But somehow it also described life. Leave room for learning. Leave room for mistakes. Leave room for growth. Psychologists often explain that people learn most effectively when mistakes happen inside a safe environment rather than a fearful one. Looking back, I realized that my confidence with both driving and English had grown because I no longer feared every small error. Instead, each mistake became useful information instead of proof that I wasn't good enough. The following weekend, while driving with my family, I found myself naturally leaving extra space between our car and the one ahead. Without thinking, I had changed. My husband noticed. You've become a calmer driver. I smiled. I think I've become a calmer person. He laughed quietly. I was thinking exactly the same thing. As the children chatted happily in the back seat, I looked through the windshield at the long line of cars moving smoothly beneath the bright American sky. For the first time, I wasn't trying to get somewhere as quickly as possible. I was simply enjoying the journey. I believed the biggest lessons were finally behind me. I couldn't have been more wrong. Only a few days later, while organizing something completely ordinary at home, I would discover a small reminder that brought every lesson together. That unexpected discovery would make me realize the greatest gift American traffic had given me wasn't safer driving at all. It was a completely different way of living, learning, and trusting the people around me. Order gave me freedom. One quiet Saturday morning, I found something I wasn't looking for, a folded parking receipt hidden inside my car's center console. Most people would have thrown it away without a second thought. But the moment I looked at that tiny piece of paper, every lesson from the past few months came rushing back. It reminded me of the nervous woman who once questioned every traffic rule, every English sentence, and every decision she made behind the wheel. I smiled because I suddenly realized the greatest change hadn't happened on the road. It had happened inside me. After cleaning the car, I decided to organize everything inside the glove compartment. Old maps, grocery receipts, children's drawings, parking tickets, and folded instruction manuals had slowly collected there over time. Then I found the receipt. It was from the day I had first driven alone to a busy shopping center after becoming comfortable with local traffic. I remembered exactly how nervous I had felt. Not because I was afraid of driving. Because I was afraid of making mistakes. I quietly laughed. That version of me already felt like someone else. Later that afternoon, my husband noticed the receipt sitting on the kitchen table. "Keeping souvenirs?" he joked. I smiled. "This little piece of paper reminds me how much I've changed." He looked at it for a moment. "I don't think the receipt matters." "No?" He shook his head. "The confidence behind it does." His answer stayed with me all day. Confidence. Not perfection. Confidence built one ordinary drive at a time. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized every simple traffic rule had quietly taught me something much bigger than driving. Stopping completely taught me patience. Using turn signals taught me respect. Leaving enough distance taught me self-control. Waiting for pedestrians taught me kindness. Following predictable rules taught me trust. None of those lessons had remained inside the car. They had followed me home. Family dinners became calmer. Small disagreements ended more quickly. I interrupted people less often. I listened more carefully. Even my English conversations had changed. When someone spoke too quickly, I no longer felt embarrassed. Instead, I simply smiled and asked politely, "Could you please say that again?" People always responded kindly. That one sentence became one of the most useful English expressions I had ever learned. Simple. Natural. Confident. Language experts often explain that communication depends far more on confidence and active listening than perfect grammar. Looking back, I understood why real-life conversations had helped me improve much faster than memorizing vocabulary alone. Every interaction gave English an emotional memory, and emotional memories stay with us much longer. The following weekend, our family drove to a nearby lake for a picnic. As I carefully followed the speed limit through quiet neighborhoods, our daughter looked out the window and smiled. "I like riding with Mom." I looked at her through the mirror. "Why?" "Because you never make us feel rushed." I wasn't expecting that answer. Neither was my husband. He smiled quietly without saying a word. Children notice things adults often overlook. They don't measure love by speeches. They notice how calmly you react. How patiently you wait. How safely you bring them home. As the afternoon sunlight reflected across the peaceful water, I realized something beautiful. Order had never taken away my freedom. It had given me the confidence to enjoy it. The title of this story finally made perfect sense. Order creates freedom. Not because rules control people. Because good rules allow everyone to trust one another. I thought that was the final lesson. Then, on the drive home, my husband asked me one simple question that I had never considered before. My answer surprised both of us. In that quiet conversation, I finally understood what America's roads had truly given me, and why this story could never have ended anywhere else. The road changed my life. If someone asked me today what the greatest lesson from driving in the United States was, they might expect me to mention traffic laws, safer roads, or better driving skills. Surprisingly, none of those would be my answer. The greatest gift I received was something I couldn't see, touch, or buy. It quietly changed the way I treated my family, the way I learned English, and even the way I looked at ordinary people every single day. Looking back now, I realize my journey was never really about traffic, it was about becoming a calmer, kinder version of myself. A few evenings after our family picnic by the lake, my husband and I were sitting on the front porch while the children played in the yard. The neighborhood was peaceful. A few cars passed slowly, neighbors walked their dogs, and children laughed as they rode bicycles along the sidewalk. My husband looked at me with a smile. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What do you think America's roads have really taught you?" For a moment, I didn't answer. I watched a driver stop gently at a nearby crosswalk so an elderly couple could cross safely. Nobody hurried them. Nobody complained. The driver simply waited. Then I looked back at my husband. "I think they taught me to trust people." He smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." I laughed softly. I used to think rules existed because people couldn't be trusted. And now? Now I think good rules exist because people choose to trust each other. The words surprised even me. Yet they felt completely true. Every stop sign. Every crosswalk. Every turn signal. Every patient driver. Together, they created something much bigger than organized traffic. They created confidence. Not confidence that nothing would ever go wrong. Confidence that most people would try to do the right thing. That realization slowly transformed every part of my daily life. Shopping became more enjoyable. Conversations became more relaxed. Family disagreements became shorter. Even learning English felt different. Instead of chasing perfect grammar, I focused on understanding people. Ironically, the less afraid I became of making mistakes, the more naturally I spoke. One afternoon, while listening to an English podcast during a drive home, the speaker said something that perfectly summarized my entire journey. Progress is built one small habit at a time. I repeated the sentence several times. One small habit at a time. Stopping completely. Waiting patiently. Listening carefully. Speaking bravely. Smiling first. Those tiny habits had quietly created enormous changes. Psychologists often explain that lasting confidence grows through repeated positive experiences rather than dramatic life-changing moments. Looking back, I understood exactly what they meant. None of my lessons happened in a single extraordinary day. They appeared through hundreds of ordinary moments that slowly reshaped the way I thought, reacted, and communicated. That is also why I believe stories are one of the best ways to learn English. Every emotion gives vocabulary meaning. Every conversation creates memory. Every real situation teaches far more than isolated grammar exercises ever could. When words become connected to everyday life, they stop feeling like lessons. They become part of who you are. Today, every time I stop at a red light, wait patiently at a four-way stop, or smile at another driver through the windshield, I remember that nervous woman from the beginning of this story. She believed freedom meant moving faster. Now I understand something completely different. Real freedom comes from knowing that respect, patience, and trust make life easier for everyone. And perhaps that's the most beautiful lesson America's roads quietly taught me. That's all for today. I'll create many more stories like this in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.